Before you scroll, ask yourself this: what happens when a child's only meal is mocked by those who have more than enough, and the world seems to turn its back on her? Pain. Some stories begin with joy, but this one begins with hunger, humiliation, and the kind of silence that cuts deeper than words. The cafeteria at Midtown Elementary in New York City was alive with noise. Trays clattered, sneakers squeaked against the tiled floor, and laughter bounced off the high walls. The smell of pizza and fries filled the air, the kind of scent that made stomachs growl and reminded everyone it was lunchtime. Everyone, that is, except one little girl. At the far end of a long table, tucked into the corner as if she wanted to vanish, sat a girl no older than 10. Her name wasn't written in bold letters anywhere, nor was she the kind of child others rushed to greet. She was quiet, the kind of quiet that made her invisible, until today. On the table before her sat a piece of plain bread, wrapped in a napkin, and a small plastic bottle of water. No juice box, no chips, no hot meal from the cafeteria line. Just bread and water. She unwrapped it carefully, as though this small meal was precious. Though the truth was it was all her family could spare. At first, no one noticed. But in places like a cafeteria, silence draws attention quicker than noise. A group of kids nearby spotted her. Their eyes darted between their own trays stacked with burgers, fries, and steaming pizza, then back to the lonely piece of bread on her napkin. The whispers began softly, almost harmlessly. Is that all she's eating? Why doesn't she have real lunch? Look, bread and water, like a prisoner. The little girl heard every word, though she kept her eyes down, tearing the bread into smaller pieces, trying to make it last longer. She told herself not to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. But whispers have a way of spreading, like fire catching in dry grass. Soon the table across from her joined in. Laughter followed. The sound stung, louder than it really was, echoing inside her chest. Some kids pointed, others smirked, and a few exaggerated their bites of greasy pizza just to make sure she noticed what she didn't have. Her shoulders curled inward. She took a sip of water, as if drinking could wash away the taste of humiliation. She wished the ground would open up and swallow her whole. The cafeteria suddenly felt larger than life, every eye on her, every laugh cutting into her like sharp glass. And still, she stayed. Because leaving meant admitting defeat. Because she had nowhere else to go. And because this tiny meal, bread and water, though mocked by others, was the only thing waiting for her each day. She lowered her head further, praying the moment would pass. But children, when they sense weakness, often don't stop. One boy leaned closer, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. What are you, poor or something? Who brings bread to lunch? Laughter exploded around the table. The sound was cruel, relentless. She felt heat rising in her cheeks, her hands trembling as she clutched the bread tighter, holding it as though it was a shield against the storm of ridicule. But it wasn't a shield. It was a target. The cafeteria was no longer just a room filled with food and chatter. To her, it became an arena, and she was the one being laughed at in the center of it all. Her chest tightened. The bread in her hand felt heavy, too heavy to finish. Shame took away her appetite. She set it down carefully, as if placing it back could erase the scene. But it didn't. And in that moment, she thought about her father, who worked late shifts cleaning office buildings, and her mother, whose health often kept her in bed. She thought about how she used to imagine lunchtime being a happy part of the day, just like the kids in the cartoons she loved. But reality was different. For her, lunchtime wasn't joy. It was survival. She wanted to be invisible again. To sink into the walls, to hide under the table, to disappear into the cracks in the floor. Anywhere but here, in this room filled with laughter. That wasn't hers. The cruelest part wasn't the bread, or even the laughter. It was the way no one stood up for her. Teachers were too busy. Friends were non-existent. She was alone, facing a storm she hadn't asked for. And so she stayed silent. But silence can be louder than screams. And in that silence, something began to stir, a shift she didn't yet see, but one that would change her life forever. Because sometimes, when the world is cruelest, destiny has a way of walking through the door. The laughter had reached its peak. It roared through the cafeteria like a wave, rolling over the small girl who sat trembling in the corner with her bread and water. Her eyes burned, though no tears fell. She had trained herself too well to hide them. But just when she thought she could not bear another second, something happened. The double doors swung open. It was not a teacher. It was not a principal, or another group of kids ready to mock her. Further. No, this was someone entirely different. A tall man stepped into the cafeteria, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as though each step carried a purpose. He wore a crisp suit, tailored to perfection, the kind of suit that didn't belong in a noisy school lunchroom. The light from the tall windows caught the edges of his tie, making it shimmer faintly. His presence alone commanded attention, not because he demanded it, but because it followed him wherever he went. For a moment, the room froze. Forks hovered in the air. Conversations died mid-sentence. The laughter that had moments ago been so loud melted into silence, as though swallowed by an invisible force. Some students gasped softly. Others whispered. "Who's that? Wait, isn't that? It can't be, what's he doing here?" The man was no ordinary visitor. He was a name many parents spoke with respect. Sometimes with envy. The kind of man whose photo appeared in magazines, whose wealth and influence stretched far beyond these cafeteria walls. He was a CEO, one of New York City's most powerful figures, the head of a company whose glass towers reached into the sky. And yet here he was, standing in the school cafeteria. He hadn't come for recognition. He hadn't come for applause. His visit was part of a quiet charity program, one that didn't make headlines but mattered to him nonetheless. He believed in education, in supporting schools where children dreamed of futures they couldn't yet see. But today, it wasn't the program that held his attention. It was something else. Something unplanned. His eyes swept across the room. He didn't scan for familiar faces, nor did he search for the principal waiting near the side doors. Instead, he seemed to be looking for something invisible, something only he could sense. And then, his gaze stopped. At the far corner of the long table, where the laughter had been loudest, he saw her. A small girl, her shoulders curled inward, her hand still wrapped around a piece of bread. She could no longer eat. She sat frozen in her seat, trying not to look up, trying not to exist. The water bottle in front of her stood like a fragile tower, the only thing separating her from the cruel world around her. Their eyes met. Just for a second. But that second stretched longer than any moment she had ever known. Something inside him shifted. Perhaps it was recognition, though he had never seen her before. Perhaps it was memory, of days long past when hunger had been a shadow he knew too well. Or perhaps it was simply compassion, the kind that cannot be taught but is born out of lived pain. Whatever it was, it held him still. The cafeteria remained silent, the kind of silence that hums with tension, like a string pulled too tightly. Every student watched, every teacher hesitated, unsure what this man would do. Because powerful men in expensive suits did not belong here. They belonged in boardrooms, not cafeterias. They belonged in luxury, not among children with trays of food. And yet, he moved. He began to walk toward her. Each step echoed against the linoleum floor, slow, deliberate, and unhurried. The sound of his shoes striking the ground replaced the laughter that had filled the air minutes ago. Students turned their heads, following him, whispers racing between them like sparks. Where's he going? Why is he walking over there? No way, he's not going to. But he was. The closer he came, the smaller she felt. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought the entire cafeteria could hear it. Her first instinct was fear. Was she in trouble? Was this man here because of her? She wanted to shrink even more into her chair, to fold herself into invisibility. Yet, at the same time, something inside her stirred, something she didn't recognize. Hope. He stopped at her table. The room held its breath. Every eye was fixed on him, waiting for his next move. The girl's fingers trembled against her napkin, the piece of bread still crumbling in her palm. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she looked up. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, met his. Once more. And in that single moment, she realized something no one else in the cafeteria did. His gaze wasn't one of pity. It wasn't one of judgment. It was something deeper. It was understanding. This is where the moment froze in time. A man whose life was measured in billions and boardroom stood face to face with a little girl whose world revolved around survival. The contrast could not have been sharper, yet, in that cafeteria, the distance between them began to close. Because sometimes, the most unexpected visitors carry with them the power to change everything. The girl froze. She hadn't moved since the moment his shadow fell across her tray. It stretched long and heavy, swallowing her little corner of the cafeteria. Her fingers clutched the edge of the table, her bread crumbling between her small hands. The entire room seemed to lean in with her, holding its breath. He could have sat anywhere. At the tables near the windows, where the sunlight caught the polished trays of the popular kids. At the front of the room, where teachers were eagerly gesturing toward empty seats, hoping to share polite conversation with a man of his stature. He could have chosen the comfort of admiration, the security of respect. But he didn't. Instead, the man, this CEO whose very presence quieted the cafeteria, pulled out the chair beside her. The scrape of the chair legs against the floor was louder than a shout. In that silence, every head turned. Every whisper stopped. The cafeteria gasped, a sound sharp and sudden, like the intake of 100 breaths at once. He lowered himself into the seat, calm and deliberate, as if this choice were the most natural thing in the world. But to everyone else, it was unthinkable. Impossible. Why would someone like him sit there, beside her? The girl's chest tightened. She didn't dare lift her head. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he would change his mind and leave. The humiliation would be worse if he did. She wanted to sink through the floor, vanish into nothing. Her shame pressed on her like a weight too heavy to carry. And then, something happened that she never expected. The man reached for her bread. Not to take it away. Not to mock it. But gently, carefully, as though he were handling something priceless. He broke it in half, his movements slow, reverent even. He held one piece in his hand, glanced at it with quiet appreciation, and smiled. "Mind if I join you?" The words were soft, almost casual. Yet in the silence of the cafeteria, they rang out like bells in a cathedral. The girl's head snapped up, her wide eyes searching his face. She wasn't used to kindness, not here. And certainly not from someone like him. His smile wasn't the polite, distant smile adults sometimes wore when they didn't mean it. No, this one reached his eyes. It was warm, gentle, patient, an invitation without pressure. Around them, the cafeteria buzzed with disbelief. Did he just? He's eating her bread. No way. Students gawked. Teachers whispered. The popular kids who had once laughed now sat frozen, their fries growing cold on their trays. It was as though the balance of power in the room had shifted, tilting toward this unlikely pair in the corner. The girl swallowed hard, her voice caught in her throat. She wanted to answer, to say yes, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she gave the faintest nod. For the first time that day, she lifted her head fully. And the laughter. The cruel, stinging laughter that had surrounded her just moments ago, melted into stunned silence. No one dared to mock now. No one dared to whisper another cruel word. Because the most powerful man in the room had chosen her table. He took a small bite of the bread, chewing thoughtfully, as though it were the richest meal he had ever tasted. He didn't flinch, didn't laugh, didn't treat it as strange. Instead, he treated it as a feast shared between equals. "You know," he said gently, setting the bread back down, "sometimes the simplest meals are the ones that remind us what really matters." Her breath caught. She stared at him, searching his face for any trace of sarcasm. There was none. He meant it. And in that moment, something inside her began to change. The shame that had pressed so heavily on her chest started to lift, piece by piece. The bread in her hand no longer felt like a burden. The water bottle beside it no longer seemed like proof of her poverty. With him sitting there, choosing her, of all people, it felt different. It felt almost enough. The room remained quiet, but it wasn't the silence of mockery anymore. It was the silence of awe. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't the girl to laugh at, the one to point fingers at. She was simply a girl at lunch, sharing her table with someone who saw her differently. And in that cafeteria corner, with bread and water between them, the beginning of something extraordinary unfolded. The bread between them was nearly gone, but the silence remained. The girl kept her eyes low, her small fingers nervously folding the edges of her napkin. She wasn't used to being noticed, certainly not like this. All her life, she had learned to shrink herself, to stay quiet so the world wouldn't have another reason to laugh. But now, with him sitting there beside her, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt waiting. He leaned slightly closer, his voice gentle. "So," he said, "how's your day been so far?" The question was ordinary. Simple. But coming from him, from someone whose face had appeared on magazine covers, whose name was spoken with reverence in New York boardrooms, it felt extraordinary. Her throat tightened. She wanted to answer, but the words tangled inside her. She glanced at him, just for a second, to see if he was serious. His eyes told her he was patient. Warm. No rush. No judgment. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. A smile tugged at his lips. Just okay. The smallest flicker of a smile touched her own, hesitant but real. Math was hard. Today, she admitted. I don't think I'm very good at it. He chuckled softly, not the kind of laugh that mocked, but one that made the air around them lighter. You know, he said, when I was your age, I thought math would be the end of me. Numbers and we didn't get along very well. Her eyes widened. She had never imagined someone like him struggling with anything. Much less math. Really? She asked, doubt in her tone. Really, he said, leaning back a little, his voice carrying the ease of honesty. But you'd be surprised. Sometimes the things we think we're worst at are just the ones we haven't learned our own way of understanding yet. The cafeteria around them stirred, whispers circling like restless shadows. Students craned their necks, pretending to eat but unable to tear their eyes away. The girl who once sat invisible was suddenly at the center of everything. And yet, for her, the cafeteria was fading. The chatter, the stares, the lingering judgment, it all blurred into background noise. All that remained sharp and clear was his voice, steady and kind. What about you? He asked. What's your favorite subject? She hesitated, nibbling the crust of her bread. Her first instinct was to shrug, to say, I don't know, because it was safer than being laughed at. But something in his eyes told her the truth would be welcome here. I like art, she said softly. Drawing, mostly. Sometimes painting, but I don't always have the supplies. Her cheeks warmed as she admitted it. I draw on notebook paper. When I can. He leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. His eyes lit with a spark that caught her by surprise. Art, he repeated, as though the word itself was precious. That's a gift. You can show people the world the way you see it. That's rare. Her breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken of her drawings like that before. To her classmates, they were silly doodles. To her teachers, distractions in the margins of assignments. But to him, they mattered. Encouraged, she dared to continue. Sometimes I dream of being an artist. Like really an artist. With real canvases and paints. Maybe even my own gallery one day. She bit her lip, lowering her eyes quickly. But, that's silly. He shook his head gently. That's not silly at all. That's brave. Do you know how many people stop dreaming because they're afraid of being laughed at? Her gaze lifted, meeting his for longer this time. His expression was steady, unwavering. He wasn't humoring her. He believed it. The whispers in the cafeteria grew louder. Students who once mocked her now fidgeted uneasily, their smirks erased. Some stared down at their trays, embarrassed, while others exchanged nervous glances. The balance of the room had shifted again, only this time not with gasps or shock, but with reflection. The girl sat a little taller, her shoulders no longer curled inward. She still felt small compared to the man beside her, but somehow, she also felt seen. Her voice, though soft, began to carry a steadier rhythm. My mom, she says dreams are important, even if they don't come true, she said. She works a lot, though. Sometimes she skips meals so I can have mine. His expression softened, a shadow of sorrow crossing his features. He didn't interrupt. He let her speak. So I don't like to complain, she continued, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. That's why I just bring bread and water. It's enough. I don't want her to worry. Her honesty hung in the air, raw and fragile. The room, still buzzing faintly, seemed to pause again. He looked at her with quiet admiration. Not pity, not sympathy, but admiration. "You're stronger than you realize," he said. For the first time in a long while, she believed it. The conversation drifted from there, gently, like a river flowing between two very different banks. He asked about her favorite colors, and she shyly admitted she loved blue, not the dull kind, but the kind that looked like the ocean in paintings. He asked about her friends, and though her answer was hesitant, she admitted she often felt alone. He didn't look away when she said it. He didn't change the subject. He simply nodded, as if to say, "I hear you." And as the minutes stretched, the cafeteria faded further. The girl who had been humiliated just moments ago now sat in dignity, her small voice carrying across the gap between her world and his. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a bridge. Two souls, worlds apart, one with wealth and power, the other with little more than bread and water, meeting in the quiet honesty of shared humanity. And though no one else realized it then, that conversation marked the beginning of a story that would change everything. The playground was nearly empty, its laughter gone with the last school bell. The swings swayed gently in the evening breeze, their chains creaking like whispers from another time. The faint glow of the city lights flickered in the distance, but here, at the edge of the schoolyard, quiet reigned. On one of the swings sat the little girl. Her small shoes scuffed at the dirt, her head bowed low as if the ground itself held her secrets. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. She glanced up, and there he was again. The man from the cafeteria, the one who had changed everything with a single act of kindness. But today, he wasn't dressed in his immaculate suit. He looked different. The sharpness of wealth had softened into something more ordinary, more human. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing toward the empty swing beside her. She shrugged lightly, not trusting her voice yet. He took the seat anyway, the old chains groaning under his weight. For a moment, they swung in silence, two figures from different worlds bound by something unspoken. Finally, he turned to her. "I wanted to check in on you. The other day. I could tell. There's more to your story." Her fingers tightened around the metal chains. She wanted to brush it off, to say she was fine, because that's what she always said. But something about his presence made the lie impossible. "My dad works a lot," she began, her words slow and careful. "He leaves before I wake up, and sometimes he doesn't come home until I'm already asleep. He works double shifts at the factory. He says he's doing it for us." The CEO listened, his gaze steady, his heart already pulling tight. "My mom," she paused, her voice trembling just slightly, "she's not well. She tries to hide it, but I can see. Some days, she can barely get out of bed. And I try not to bother her. I just do what I can." She looked away quickly, as though ashamed of the truth that tumbled out. "That's why I bring bread and water. It's not because I don't like the food here, it's just," her voice cracked. "It's just what we have." The CEO felt the sting in his chest, the ache of recognition. Her words weren't just hers. They were echoes of a childhood he knew all too well. He saw himself in her. The boy who had once sat in classrooms pretending not to hear the whispers about his torn clothes. The boy who ate slowly, making scraps of food last longer, praying no one would notice his hunger. The boy who had been invisible, until someone, one unexpected person, chose to see him. His throat tightened as he leaned closer. "You don't have to hide that from me," he said. Softly. "You're stronger than you know. And you're not alone." She blinked up at him, her wide eyes searching his face. For the first time, she saw not just a man of wealth and power, but someone who understood. Someone who knew. He took a deep breath, memories rushing back like shadows. "When I was your age," he began, "I used to eat stale bread too. Sometimes nothing at all. My father, he was gone, and my mother worked herself to the bone just to keep a roof over our heads. I remember sitting on a playground just like this one, wondering if things would ever change." Her lips parted slightly. The idea that someone like him, a man whose name was written across skyscrapers, had once been like her was unthinkable. What happened?" she whispered. He smiled faintly, though it carried the weight of scars. "I held on to hope. I worked hard. Yes. But more than that, I never stopped believing life could be different. And along the way, there were people who believed in me. People who reminded me that hunger doesn't define you. That being poor doesn't mean being less." Her eyes filled, not with tears of sadness, but with something deeper, relief. For the first time, she didn't feel strange, or weak, or broken. She felt seen. The swing creaked as she rocked gently. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I feel like no one notices me. Like I could just disappear, and it wouldn't matter." His jaw tightened. He had thought the same thing once. But now, looking at her, he knew the truth, her life mattered more than she could ever imagine. He leaned closer, his voice firm yet kind. "Listen to me. You matter. Every dream you have, every drawing you make, every single part of who you are, it matters. Don't let anyone make you feel small. Not your hunger. Not your silence. Not the kids who laugh. You are more than all of that." Her chest rose with a shaky breath, and for the first time that week, a flicker of warmth reached her eyes. The sun had dipped lower now, painting the playground in shades of gold and orange. The world around them seemed to pause, holding its breath as a bond deepened. Between them, two lives, once strangers, now tied together by wounds they both carried. And as the wind brushed past, carrying the faint sound of the city, the CEO made a silent promise. He would not let her story end the way his almost did. Because sometimes, the most powerful change begins not with riches, but with the simple act of sitting beside someone, and listening to the wounds they thought no one could see. The library was nearly deserted that evening. Rows of bookshelves stood like silent witnesses, the air carrying the faint scent of old paper and polish. A single lamp glowed in the corner, throwing a warm circle of light over a wooden table. It was there, in that pocket of stillness, that she waited. Her small hands fidgeted nervously, folding and unfolding a crumpled paper, edges frayed from being opened too many times. She heard the sound of the door creak open. And when she looked up, there he was, the man who had sat beside her, the man whose presence had changed her days from shadows into something resembling light. He smiled faintly, but his smile faded when he noticed her expression. Her eyes were not bright with curiosity or shy laughter as before. Tonight, they carried something heavier. Without a word, she held out the folded paper. Her hand trembled. "For you," she whispered. He hesitated, sensing the weight behind the gesture. Slowly, almost reverently, he took it from her. The paper was worn thin, fragile as though it had survived years of careful keeping. He unfolded it with deliberate care, his breath shallow, and his eyes scanned the words. And then, he froze. The handwriting was delicate, uneven in places, yet filled with warmth. A woman's voice seemed to echo through the ink. It was a letter. A letter addressed to him. His name, written plainly at the top. Not his title, not Sir, not Mr. His name. He read the first line, his chest tightening. The letter was from her mother. A rush of air left his lungs, his hands trembling as if the page itself burned. Memories he had buried deep began clawing their way back. He remembered the early years of his company, the endless contracts, the decisions made quickly, coldly, in the hunger to rise above failure. And there, woven into the neat lines of the letter, was the echo of one of those choices. How it had reached into the life of this woman, and through her, into the life of this child. The girl watched him, her small body tense. I found it in one of my mother's old boxes, she said softly. She wrote it years ago, but she never sent it. She said maybe one day I would understand. His throat tightened. The words blurred before his eyes, but the meaning cut clear. Her family had once been tied to him, not as strangers, but through consequences of a deal he had made in the ruthless climb of his youth. A contract signed, a factory closed, jobs lost. Her father had been among those workers, scrambling ever since to keep the family afloat. And her mother had carried the weight of that struggle until her health gave way. The papers shook in his hands. Silence pressed in heavy around them. When he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, his eyes were no longer calm, no longer distant. They carried something raw, shock, grief, remorse. I didn't know, he whispered. I never realized, his words broke, his voice trembling. What I did back then, it touched your family. It touched you. She didn't answer. She only looked at him, her small face fragile yet steady, as if waiting to see the truth in his eyes rather than his apology. His chest ached as guilt coursed through him. The walls of success he had built, brick by ruthless brick, now revealed cracks he had never seen. Behind his empire, behind the towers with his name etched in stone, there were lives whose struggles traced back to his choices. And here sat one of them, this girl who had eaten bread and water alone in a cafeteria, bearing the scars of decisions he once thought were only numbers on a page. But alongside the guilt rose something else, something deeper. A realization. This was not coincidence. This was not chance. Their lives were not two strangers. Threads brushing in passing. They were connected. Bound by an invisible knot, tied. Years before either of them had understood its weight. His hands lowered the letter slowly to the table. For a long moment, he sat in silence, staring at it as though it held not just words, but judgment. Finally, he looked at her again. Your mother, his voice cracked, softer now. She was braver than I'll ever be. She faced what my choices brought, and still she wrote. With kindness. Not anger, not hatred. Just hope. The girl swallowed, her small chin trembling. She always told me that people are more than their mistakes. Those words cut straight through him. His vision blurred, not from the dim light, but from the storm rising within. He had built his life on strength, on resilience, on an image of perfection. But here, in the quiet of the library, a child had pulled down the veil. And for the first time in years, he felt something break. Not his power. Not his control. But the walls around his heart. The letter lay between them now, fragile yet unyielding, a bridge across the gulf of their worlds. He reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly as it rested near hers. "You've given me something I can never repay," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "The truth. The chance to see what I could not see before. And I promise you this." He paused, drawing a slow breath as though binding himself to the words. "I will not run from it. I will not hide behind excuses. If my choices once brought pain to your family, then my choices now will bring healing. I owe your mother that. I owe you that." Her eyes widened, glistening in the lamplight. She said nothing, but for the first time, she let herself believe him. The library seemed smaller then, quieter, as though the books themselves leaned in to witness the moment. Two lives, bound by hidden truths, had finally seen the light. And in that quiet, the air shifted. Not with shame, but with the beginning of something else. Responsibility. Redemption. The kind of bond that does not form by accident, but by revelation. The world was still asleep when they arrived. Coney Island Pier stretched out into the Atlantic, its wooden planks glistening with the dew of dawn. The air was cool, salted with the scent of the sea, and above them the sky shifted slowly from deep indigo into shades of rose and gold. It was a place where the city's noise seemed distant, replaced by the rhythmic hush of waves and the cries of seagulls circling above. The girl walked beside him, her small footsteps light against the boards, while his longer stride slowed so as not to leave her behind. Neither spoke at first. The silence wasn't heavy, it was peaceful, filled with the kind of quiet that comes after storms, when the world finally breathes again. She clutched the edges of her sweater as the breeze tousled her hair. He kept his hands in his pockets, eyes on the horizon where the first sliver of sun peeked over the water. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "You know," he said, "for years I thought success meant skyscrapers with my name on them, rooms filled with people waiting for my decisions. But standing here, I think I was wrong." The girl tilted her head, curious. "What does it mean now?" He looked down at her, his gaze lingering on the determination in her young eyes. Eyes that had seen hardship but refused to close to hope. "It means this," he answered quietly. "Walking here with you. Knowing that maybe, just maybe, I can build something that matters, not just for me, but for you, for others. For your future." Her lips curved into a small, uncertain smile. For a long time, the idea of a future had felt like a distant dream, too far, too fragile to imagine. But here, in the golden glow of dawn, it seemed closer, almost within reach. She stopped walking and leaned against the wooden railing, gazing out at the waves rolling toward the shore. The water glistened under the rising sun, endless and alive. "My mom used to tell me that the ocean was like life," she said softly. "Always moving. Always changing. She said even the hardest tides don't last forever." His chest tightened at her words. The letter, her mother's handwriting, her quiet resilience, they were threads weaving themselves into him, reshaping the man he thought he was. He stepped closer, resting a hand gently on the railing beside hers. "She was right," he murmured. "The tides change. And sometimes, they bring us to the people we were meant to find." The girl looked up at him then, her eyes glistening not with tears of sadness, but with something brighter, trust. For a moment, time seemed to still. The pier, the waves, the rising sun, all of it framed a truth larger than either of them. They were no longer simply a CEO and a little girl. They were two souls whose paths had been tied long before this morning, now choosing to walk forward together. She broke the silence with a whisper. "Do you really think my life can be different?" His answer came without hesitation. "I don't just think it. I promise it." He crouched slightly, so his eyes were level with hers. "I see strength in you, more than you realize. And I'll do everything I can to make sure the world sees it too. You deserve more than bread and water at a lunch table. You deserve the chance to dream, and to make those dreams real." The girl's breath caught. For years she had carried her struggles quietly, never expecting anyone to notice, much less believe in her. And yet here he was, not with pity, not with charity, but with something far greater, belief. As the sun climbed higher, streaking the sky with fire and gold, she felt a shift within herself. The cafeteria laughter, the humiliation, the loneliness, all of it began to fade. In its place bloomed a fragile but growing hope. She turned back to the ocean, letting the wind rush against her face. "Then I'll try," she said, her voice steady. "I'll try to make her proud." He smiled, though there was a tremor in it. "You already have." They stood side by side, watching the horizon open before them. The city behind them would soon wake, bustling, hurried, loud. But in that moment, on that pier at dawn, it felt as if the world belonged only to them. For her, the world no longer seemed cold or unreachable. It was bright, alive, full of possibilities she had never dared to picture. For him, the meaning of his life shifted once more. Success was no longer written in contracts or profits. It was here, in the laughter he hoped to restore to her, in the future he vowed to help build, in the small hand that brushed against his as they stood together. The tide rushed below, steady and endless. Above them, the sun rose higher, scattering shadows from the pier. And in that light, two lives changed forever. Not through grand speeches, not through wealth or status, but through one simple act of kindness that had begun with a piece of bread and a seat at a lonely table. Sometimes, destiny does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes, it begins quietly, when someone chooses to sit beside you.